Hello, and welcome to this slightly belated March edition of DBTT. Hi, Dean. How are you?
I'm pretty good, thanks, Benoit. Yourself?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of work and a lot of thoughts going through my brain in the run-up to the Fiber to Home Council event in London in just 10 days from March 14th to 16th. Full disclosure, my company Fiber Revolution is a partner. And in fact, if you're looking for a discount code, feel free to reach out. Yeah, so I think for today, our list of topics are going to be primarily, though not only fiber focused or fixed focus. Um, One of the things that we see as kind of pervading the whole set of discussions on telecoms right now is sovereignty, and that's something we're going to come back to at the end. But I think you have some
Yeah.
strong views on that, Dean.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I've got my own event on April 23rd. It's another Unthinkable Lab on, particularly on telecom sovereignty. And I'd say the bulk of discussion on sovereignty, I'll talk later on, is on cloud and AI and a bit on chips. But there's actually quite a lot going on with networks, telecoms, voice, connectivity, and so on. And I'll come back to that later on.
Excellent. All right, so maybe just to ease us into this topic, and obviously the other pervading element to the conversation is the DNA, which is now fully underway in terms of being discussed everywhere, especially in Brussels.
Mm.
So one thing I noticed, which is worth mentioning, and I don't quite know what to make of it, to be honest, is that the DNA seems to have thrown cable under the bus. Until now, the terminology in the European code was VHCN, very high capacity networks, which more or less explicitly included cable, or at least DOCSIS 3.1 and beyond, as being, an equivalent in terms of performance to whatever fiber could deliver. It looks like that terminology has been superseded by a less clearly identifiable, or maybe not less clearly identifiable. Actually, VHCN was pretty obscure for a lot of people. But now basically the DNA says gigabit as, kind of the goal, the target. But they do define gigabit as symmetrical, which cable will struggle to deliver.
Mm.
So basically, doing a 1 gig symmetrical on DOCSIS 3.1 is very complicated and it requires a lot of resources, which is so unlikely to happen. Now, I'm not sure what this means, to be honest, because on the one hand, that's the basis on which the European targets are now set. But on the other hand, if you're a private operator deploying cable and you're not the incumbent, you can easily take the point of view that this doesn't really affect you in any way. In other words,
Uh,
unless governments start saying,
mm.
well, you're non-compliant, I'm not
The,
sure it makes a difference.
I think one of the things, this is something that, I mean, I was spent yesterday in Brussels at the BEREC Stakeholder Workshop, and I also looked through, they published a document this week on their BEREC's early assessment of the DNA, the draft DNA. And they specifically call out the role of, they refer to it as HFC, hybrid fiber coax, which is cable networks, as being unclear. But one of the messages which came out strongly yesterday was the DNA draft has a perceived lack of clarity and a few omissions. And so cable is one of them. Another is where you've got fiber to the building, but then the last drop is on some sort of LAN technology. Another point they said is, what do you do about in building for things like MDUs, where you've got copper networks inside the building? So you might have fiber to the building, but then either copper twisted pair or coax up and
Or,
down between the
or
apartments.
or Ethernet.
Yeah,
So when it comes to copper switch off, this is going to be, I think, one of the
yeah.
areas that absolutely needs to be clarified. So I mean, this is a good segue because obviously that's a very discussed topic. I think possibly a bit too much, if I'm honest. Not in the sense of this is not an important and interesting topic. Of course it is, but my point is, in the grand scheme of the DNA, I think this is a relatively long term and relatively uh,
Solvable.
well, I'm not so sure about that. So I was at another BEREC workshop a couple of weeks ago in Brussels, specifically on copper switch off, and
Okay.
and, and I was speaking there, and like one of the things that came out very clearly is that the rationale for copper switch off is unclear. I mean, there's an impact assessment in the DNA attached documents that basically says, well, there's huge amounts of value to be unlocked by switching the copper off. But in reality, when you start digging in a little bit, it's more like that value is unlocked from having the entire economy switch to fiber, which I mean, is associated with copper switch off, but is not a benefit directly of copper switch off. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this is a very theoretical construct in
Hmm.
the impact assessment. But for example, there is no analysis of Spain or Sweden to say, well, actually, they have gotten that 1% GDP increase from copper switch off. If it was as clear cut as that, then these types of analyses would have done a lot to kind of encourage other countries to say we
Yeah.
absolutely do need to accelerate this.
We should have some proof points. Actually, another question is, I don't know. Is in building copper still used in Spain and Sweden, or have they ripped everything out the risers of apartment blocks and done
So
with that?
so I know pretty well about the Spanish market, and I do think there is fiber to the actual home everywhere, or fiber to the dwelling or premises,
Hmm.
whatever we want to call it. In Sweden, I would be surprised because the initial deployments of fiber in Sweden were very much FTTB.
Hmm.
I would be surprised if there wasn't still a whole lot of Ethernet in building, because
Yeah,
that was the initial deployment model in MDUs in Sweden,
yeah,
and
yeah.
and it works fine. So
Uh,
if it works fine, why would you change
and
that?
and also it just brings in so many complexities. I mean, who's then responsible? It's a bit like the indoor wireless stuff that I spend a lot of time on. Is it the building owner that pays for it? Is it one or more of the operators? What happens if you look in
Yeah.
the riser and there's asbestos, or I don't know whatever it is, the thing you think, oh, it's going to cost a fortune to update the wiring inside buildings.
Well, and actually, this is also an area where having a Europe-wide ruling is very difficult because ownership of what's inside the building depends on a country-by-country basis.
Oh,
So
okay.
typically in Sweden, the building owner owns whatever infrastructure is inside the building. So basically, uh, theoretically, they should pay for deployment, although in many instances, the operator said, well, I'll take that cost, but it still belongs to the building owners. Whereas in France, whatever fiber is inside the building is still owned by the operator.
Okay.
So there's a lot of legal kind of
Hmm.
stuff that's not associated with telecom specifically, but with land ownership and building ownership and this kind of stuff. So that's a second point you're right to raise that I was going to put on the table. Is there's still a lack of clarity as to what copper we're talking about exactly.
I mean that phrase "lack of clarity" came out generally about the DNA yesterday in not just comments from BEREC, but a lot of people I spoke to were saying for something that's supposed to be a simplification, it's basically 400 pages of complexity, and there's a lot of things where there's just gaps in what was in the DNA draft, and there's lack of definitions and sort of a fair amount of hand waving.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. But when it comes specifically to copper switch off, one of the really interesting points, and I'm hoping that there's a bit more kind of conversation about this in London in a couple of weeks, is basically Peter Alexiadis, who's a really interesting and very skilled legal guy in the telecom space, said, look, under European law, there's a very distinct possibility that forcing an operator to switch their copper off could entitle them to compensation. And suddenly you go like, oh, that certainly hasn't been factored into any calculations as to benefits of copper switch off. Because the thing is, like, we use France and Sweden and Spain as examples, but these are countries where the operator actively wants to accelerate copper switch off because it's the incumbent, it's in their benefit. But if you look at Germany or Italy, the incumbent's in a very different place, and they do not want to switch the copper off. So how do you, well, can the tools that are in the DNA actually force you to switch off if you don't want to? And if that is the case, then are you entitled to some compensation for basically having to scrap an asset that you own and it's still working? And then, of course, as part of that whole discussion, the bit that I think gets omitted to a certain extent is the end user. In other words, there is an understanding in the DNA and more broadly in the countries that have, accelerated copper switch off, that you need to have a substitute network, not necessarily enabled to, in order to switch the copper off, but at least as a public policy goal, everyone needs to have access to broadband, is a generally good rule. There's a much less clear, in my opinion, objective around, particularly the UK is a very good example of that, around people who have invested in fiber infrastructure that are not the incumbent, and that you would naturally imagine would be where customers would go when the copper gets switched off. But that's actually why BT doesn't want to switch the copper off in areas where they haven't deployed fiber. So there's a big ambiguity there. And the rule actually, this is a really interesting point that that Tony Shortall raised at that BEREC meeting, which I had alluded to, but he went a lot more in depth and he kind of confirmed my hunch, which was that there is a 95% deployment target after which the regulator, the national regulator under the future DNA rules, could then impose copper switch off. That's very easy to game. You just deploy to 90% in a given area and then you stop. And so basically, not only can copper switch off no longer be mandated, but in addition, we've lost 5% potential coverage just because it's more in the interest of the incumbent to not go there.
And I mean, there's so many second order effects, whether you're gaming those rules, one of the things is if you're switching off copper, you're implicitly telling people you must have a new hole drilled through your wall and fiber run through your garden, which I can imagine if a certain proportion of people will be unhappy with. There's a set of other things which has been on my mind, which is around, often with the copper switch off, we're going to have PSTN switch off at the same time, or the new network you will be PSTN optional.
I would say always. I don't see how you maintain PSTN without.
I mean, it depends a little bit on the rules, but what that then implies is, and this is something which I've been looking at a couple of recent events, is all of the emergency calling will either become wireless by default or wireless primary, which then has essentially means you need to be able to call 112 or 999 or 911 in the US everywhere indoors, because there's not going to be necessarily a fixed phone you can use. Even more complicated in the US, where emergency calls need to get Z-axis height above ground as well, if you've got multi-story buildings, and you've got to be within one floor, so emergency services know you're on the 5th floor rather than the 6th or the 9th or whatever. And so that one of the corollaries is that if you're going to switch off your copper and therefore switch off your PSTN, you've got to make sure your indoor wireless coverage and the ability to dial emergency calls is pretty ubiquitous, and ideally that the regulator checks that and monitors it. and doing a drive test for wireless coverage won't
Not
tell you whether
not gonna
the
cut
stairwell,
it.
a concrete stairwell. If you think of a big building with a concrete stairwell, and there's a fire, and you're going to be in the emergency exit stairwell, can you call for fire service? I mean, there's all sorts of knock-on impacts here.
Well, and I mean, to take a step back to a slightly broader one, which is rural. I mean, is rural coverage good enough? I mean, one of the things that struck me looking at, again, the UK market, but I'm pretty sure this is true, in a lot of other places, is there are a lot of private 5G networks that are actually there to substitute for poor general MNO service, and yet these areas look like they are covered, on coverage maps and stuff like this. So you're right. I don't think that particular issue has been really accounted for in the current setup.
I mean, especially because the copper switch off is happening in parallel with the 2G, 3G switch off, which makes all of that even worse.
Or could make that even worse. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, I agree. And bizarrely, the 2G, 3G switch off is barely mentioned anywhere, for reasons I don't necessarily understand.
It came out of the BEREC workshop as some work that's been done in their future wireless evolution. I can't remember the name of the working group. In particular, because that then means that all calls have to be IP based using VoLTE or VoNR. And there's been issues, including in Sweden, actually, where on certain phones you can't make emergency calls because not every phone registers on the operator's IMS for VoLTE calls. I know Rudolf Vanderberg has done some excellent
exactly.
work.
I was going to mention that this is something he's been on top of, and anyone who wants to look into these particular issues should check out Rudolf's writing on this.
Yeah.
So all of this actually ties into another topic, which I think is now getting a lot of prominence, and I suspect will be discussed at the FTTH Council. But there's this ambiguity, and it's not just from the DNA, because it's been around for a while now, about the European targets being set at 100% coverage of fiber, effectively, because now any other alternative is no longer part of the definition. And yet, very few countries have a realistic path to 100% fiber coverage. I was speaking to a regulator just earlier this week, and they'll remain nameless, but they said, in our calculations, we don't see FTTH deployment going much beyond 80%. So how do we deal with the remaining 20? And this is where, and it's going to tie back to the sovereignty question as well. This is where, like, a laissez-faire approach would be, look, well, satellite will pick that up. And I know that, both Starlink and Kuiper are actually pushing this as, we can do this, which is technically maybe true. I'd have some doubts about capacity, but does raise, significant sovereignty issues around that particular part.
There's the other thing, 5G fixed wireless in the middle, I'd say, between the richer fiber and the sort of pulling the satellite handle. There's a 5G FWA bucket in between.
I absolutely agree, and this is where I am a bit irritated at the vendors who are not. I don't think they don't have a coherent discourse about what they can now deliver with fixed wireless access. And I think the public perception or the public policy perception of fixed wireless access is 5 years old. And 5 years ago, it was a lot of promises that were not delivered. And so now there is this kind of ingrained view that FWA does not allow you to deliver not even a fiber equivalent service, but maybe not even 100 meg service, which is patently not the case. But I'm irritated because the vendors are not, openly saying, look, guys, we're here. So the only ones we're hearing are the non-European satellite providers. And the European vendors are just not addressing this.
I mean, Ericsson and Nokia both talk up FWA a fair amount, and especially because of the US growth in it, and to an extent, some other markets, maybe Japan and others.
But not in Europe.
But in Europe, no, they don't pitch it as much. I think it's because they look at Europe and also, to be fair, Middle East, and often it gets grouped into EMEA. And they look at most of the Gulf states, and they're fully fibre pretty much because they've got lots of MDUs. And actually, a lot of Europe is MDU heavy, and I think that's why. The other side to it is Europe has been so slow on getting that together on millimeter wave, which actually both Ericsson and Nokia now claim to have 10, 12 kilometer reach. With millimeter wave. But that means external installation, and it's sort of, and I think until they knew where the fiber stopped, there was like an emphasis on pushing FWA in other markets of India and Africa and Australia and places. So I think you're right. They could probably be doing with a bit more of a pivot to that, but there needs to be a signal from the policymakers that that's an acceptable part of the solution, and they've been a bit equivocal for the most part.
Well, and certainly the DNA doesn't help there, because there is no recognition that last 5 to 8% might be largely theoretical.
And to be honest, the mythical gigabit is something which I mean, why is it a gigabit? Why isn't it 700 meg? Why isn't it 1.3 gig? Who picked this nice round number, which is obviously, so we all like 1,000. It's got lots of zeros in it, but is there any science but why it has to be 1,000 rather than 700? Let's say.
No, probably not. But I mean, public targets always pick something, and it's not necessarily with a huge amount of science behind it. I don't so much object to that as to the kind of lack of recognition that the target, if the target was described as aspirational, I would be okay with that, right? But the target is described as an absolute. And it's actually used in public policy discussions by people like Connect Europe to say, well, at the current rate, we will not have 100% by 2053 or whatever. And you're like, but your members have no intention of deploying, so why are you even saying that?
And in particular, is then I know why. It's because they've then added in the 8 million euros it would take to get fibre out to some remote island somewhere, and that then helps them with their spurious investment gap calculations.
No, but that's what I find annoying. By not engaging into this discussion, which I think is a really important one, I think the policymakers are actually doing themselves and the industry a disservice, because it means it's a lot harder to look at this dispassionately and with kind of cold rational numbers and say, well, what's a realistic option here? And I mean, I'm all for, like, everyone should have a gigabit if possible, but there is an if possible in that sentence, which seems to have just gone out the window.
Anyway,
so I think that's going to be a big topic as well at the council event. And one thing which I really wanted to discuss with you, because you probably understand this way better than I do, is we're always talking about fiber as an endpoint to broadband, but the reality is that's not the endpoint. The endpoint is actually Wi-Fi, because in 95 or whatever, you probably know the numbers better than I do, but I would say 90+% of devices are actually not connected physically to the router. They're actually using Wi-Fi to operate. And so the quality of the Wi-Fi becomes a key question. The spectrum availability of Wi-Fi becomes a key question. And also, I think you have some news from the US that the router where the country where the router was designed and built becomes an important consideration as well.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, so obviously, if you look around, whether it's a home or an office, the bulk of endpoints these days are Wi-Fi connected in the home. Yes, there's some indoor to outdoor cellular, but there's no cellular TVs. There's few cellular laptops. All of your IoT devices will either use Wi-Fi or something like a Bluetooth or a Zigbee via a Wi-Fi gateway, probably. Smart speakers, all this stuff, and obviously you have high density of Wi-Fi in MDUs, where you've also got to think about interference in the number of channels with the apartments next to you and the floors above and below. And that gets back to the perennial discussion about things like 6 gigahertz spectrum in the US. They're now starting to look at the lower 7 gigahertz as well. And we know where that took us with the RSPG's last look at the upper 6 gig in Europe, which is sort of heavily cellular focused. Be interesting to see if that gets a rethink at some point. I do note now Brussels actually is understanding this a bit more than it did a year or two ago. And so Wi-Fi cropped up at the BEREC workshop. There's a couple of mentions in the DNA. There's this understanding that having fibre that goes as far as the front door doesn't actually get you to all of your economic goals, your social goals, your inclusiveness goals, your productivity goals. And you do actually need to connect endpoints, whether that's a TV or it's a telemedicine device or whatever it happens to be. So I think that's good. I noticed that there's now a permanent representative of Wi-Fi Alliance in Brussels, rather than getting an occasional visit from their overworked global guy, regulatory guy. Whilst Broadband Alliance is there's two Portuguese guys who are heading it up at the moment. So it's good that there is a bit more profile on that, and a recognition that the hybrid networks are going to be essential. And there's even possibly, and this is something where there was the call for what next year's BEREC projects and work program is. Their wireless group is considering having indoor wireless, and I'll be putting a submission in saying, yeah, that's a great idea. We should actually have more specific documents coming out of Brussels on that. So I think that's interesting. And then in the US, there's a completely different development in the last week or so, where suddenly the FCC put out a paper last week saying routers, not just Wi-Fi, but consumer grade routers, not manufactured in the US, will be subject to their essentially import restriction policy. I can't remember the formal name of it, in the same way that you can't buy foreign made drones in the US anymore. And it's like all of a sudden, all Wi-Fi routers are subject to the same rules unless you get an exemption. Now, given basically every single Wi-Fi router in the US is made in Taiwan or China or maybe Vietnam, that's a big problem. And essentially, if going forward, if you move house or you want to switch provider, they can't provide you with a Wi-Fi gateway or router. They either need to have an existing one refurbed, or they just need to try and work out how this exemption policy works. Interestingly, someone pointed out that the only company that does make at least some of their routers, consumer grade routers in the US, is Starlink, rather interestingly, where although the latest smaller ones are actually made in Vietnam, historically they're in home, because with Starlink broadband you have the dish outside and you have the Wi-Fi router inside, and they actually have made some in Texas in the past, and whereas all the sort of Netgear and Sagemcom and all the rest of them generally are shipped in. And so I was also speculating whether maybe the FCC and maybe the Department of Homeland Security has identified a specific malware threat that they believe is related to, whether it's the chipsets, the firmware. So maybe there is a genuine issue rather than protectionism, or a combination of the two. I read a post last week speculating, well, imagine in Europe if we did the same. There are some European Wi-Fi manufacturers, Sagemcom's one, and Mikrotik in Latvia and a couple of others, but it would still, a lot of the operator branded ones are actually manufactured in Taiwan or elsewhere.
Yep.
That would be hugely disruptive, and you could wave the sovereignty banner, But it's interesting that there's now, we've had all this before with mobile network equipment, but I wasn't
Yeah.
expecting it to read across to consumer grade Wi-Fi access boxes.
Yeah. And as you say, I mean, this comes back to this overarching theme of sovereignty. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this workshop that you're organizing in a few weeks?
Yeah, on April 23rd, I'm running my next Unthinkable Lab workshop with Andrew Collinson and also supported by Telecom TV. It's a small group, maybe 30 people in a room under Chatham House rule. And here we're going to talk about what is telecom sovereignty, because a lot of the sovereignty discussion at the moment is around data and cloud and AI and chips. But networks and telecoms have some intersection points. In some cases, you're finding telcos being the national sovereign cloud provider. I spoke to one in Central Asia yesterday. But there's a lot more in terms of sovereignty for telcos, either that they can run internally in terms of their own network equipment, the Wi-Fi routers being an example, or where they can offer sovereign telecom services and solutions to enterprises, to government. And I've got a sort of framework now in my mind where you've got sovereign connectivity, which is things like zero trust networks. It's resilient and redundant fiber for utilities and government connections. Maybe it's for really secure requirements. It's quantum key distribution and things like that. Then I think there's a category which is really interesting and overlooked that I'm calling sovereign telecom solutions or products. And this is where I think you're going to see stuff like contact centers or next gen voice services and maybe integrated security, where you could have, say, a sovereign contact center for a bank or a healthcare service or the tax office or somewhere, where your data is stored in country, and which is, I mean, the big worry in Europe in particular is that there's essentially a metaphorical big red off switch in the Oval Office, and that we obviously there's certain things that would prefer to have locally resident. Now that could still be using foreign-made elements and components, but it has to have the governance, the control, the encryption keys, locally. And then the last part of this, so you've got the connectivity, there's the solutions, and the last part is this stack. And the stack is like cloud and telecoms and supply chain. And that's where it gets really messy, where fundamentally there's never going to be a European equivalent of NVIDIA. And we are going to be reliant on a number of sort of US and China made components for some time in certain areas. But you could start to sort of work whether I think the cloud aspect to it is the hardest. Is sovereign cloud going to be a European partner with AWS and Azure and Google that we see already in a lot of areas, or is it going to be this sort of idea of a Euro stack where they try and build the whole thing and then get developers to sign up and a toolkit and all of the stuff, all of the APIs that's sort of sovereign European? And to be honest, I have grave doubts that that's feasible, except in maybe the military can do one or whatever. But is your average European retailer, where you've got a developer who's used to using AWS, suddenly going to be writing their applications to whatever that platform is and Mistral AI rather than OpenAI? I doubt it. So I think that there's the networking connectivity, the integrated solution sovereignty, and then there is something in this stack and supply chain, but I think we need to be a bit more nuanced on what's realistic. And that's one of the things we're going to explore in the workshop. I'll put a link in the show notes. And so if you're interested in signing up, if you contact me, I'll probably be able to do a discount for listeners of this as well.
It sounds like a really interesting program. I'll actually be in the UK that week, but on vacation for once, so I will not be able to join you. I will be in London the week before, however, for the FTTH Council Europe. If you do want to meet, please do. And I think both Dean and I are very keen to also maybe have these discussions in public, if that makes sense, for events and stuff like that. So if you're running events and you think it would be interesting to have us, discuss these things and maybe interact with an audience on some of these topics, I think we're very keen to do that.
Yeah, we've done a couple of sort of Ben and Dean live on stage events, and that's actually quite interesting, because if you've got audience participation and maybe a host or an MC doing a sort of two-way fireside chat, I think that's an interesting format. So please do get in touch if you'd like us to be gracing your event in future.
Okay, and that's us for this month, I think. Dean, see you soon, probably. And in any case, at the latest, see you next month.
Fantastic. Thanks. Have a good one. Cheers. And thanks.
Bye.
And everyone subscribe, please. Thank you.